Ich weiß nicht, welche Sprache ich darf reden. Ich hätte mir gebeten, ich soll sagen, ein Shiur in Yiddish. This is Mamelushin. But as I approached the Besmedish, I was told that somebody about the mass that I give the Shiur in English. Heute wollte ich dürfen sagen, the Shiur zweimal, but I'm going to miss a flight. Ich kann nur sagen, ein Shiur. Und ich meine, die wichtigste Sache ist, dass wer sie kommt zur Shiur, soll verstehen die Shiur. Ist der Schkoll hat mir gesagt, dass Hand wird sein an exception, und wir sagen die Shiur in English. How am I doing? Yiddish in English? Ich verstehe mal ein Hilches Ribbis in Koilel, a gewaltige Mekzoya beteura, and it's a fascinating limit. So many times I start a Shiur, and it's a soul, and I say, Ayom anachnu oskim besugya merateket. Today we're learning a fascinating sugya, and then I say, did I ever learn a sugya that's not fascinating? I am eipam amarti shiur besugya shelo merateket. So I don't know where you're holding in Hilchas Ribbis, and therefore the Shiur today is a Hagdoma Klolis. And the Yesodis will talk about, you're going to come back again and again almost in every sugya in Hilchas Ribbis. Isur Ribbis Mahi. There's an entire criteria, a group of mitzvah sheba mamoin, or isurei mamoin. Is Ribbis a veheta, or is it momenes? Is it choshe mishpat, or is it yoredeya? And in today's brief shiur, we'll touch upon 15 mekoros. And I can't really reach a clear conclusion. Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, and medaf learn in jede sigya bazinda. But first and foremost, and very many made this ha'ora, this observation. The Rambam writes all the Hilchas Ribbis and Sefer Mishpotim, Hilchas Malva ve'loiva. The Tur writes Hilchas Ribbis in Yoredeya, from Kuf Nun Chesan. Lecha that's a Machlokes Rambam and Tur. The Rambam holds that Hilchas Ribbis is momenes, dum yede gezel, and that's why it belongs in Sefer Mishpotim, Hilchas Malva ve'loiva. The Tur maintains Sisa v'heter, medate. Person knows what he's paying for. He's paying for benefit that he achieved, that he had. It's only fair that he pays. Mitzadina momenis is nishkanisa. It's all about Sisa v'heter, gzeres hakosov, gazra toiro. However, the Tur writes in Siman Kufnentes, hoyel v'oser leyodon, because we already mentioned the halacha of Ribbis. Kufnun Ches, Kufnun Tes, in your day speaks about different halachas for Yisrael and Goyim, and that is where we learn the din that you are allowed to take Ribbis from a Goy. The Torah writes Hoyel v'oser leyodon, and the Bach explains Hoyel v'oser leyodon. We already discussed one halacha of Ribbis, so let's have all the halachas of Ribbis. So l'chayra, if an apology is needed, why we write Hilchas Ribbis in Yoredeya, so the maskona should be, actually it belongs in Choshe Mishpat. And the Torah has no machlokes with the Rambam where Hilchas Ribbis belong. So l'chayra, the mashmuas would be, Kuli al Mamoidim, it's about Choshe Mishpat, it's about momenes. I think the opposite conclusion is the right one. Because Hoyel v'oser leyodon really doesn't make any sense. Hilchas Ribbis is a gewaldige Mekzoya, and it goes all the way 15 simonim and more. So because you learn one halacha of Ribbis, which belongs to the previous sugyas of Ma ben Yisrael Agoy, that is why you write all Hilchas Ribbis shaloi b'mkoimam. So my pshat in the Bach would be, everybody agrees that Hilchas Ribbis might be Issa v'heta. So why does the Rambam write it in Sefer Mishpotim? Darkoi shel Rambam. The Rambam is the most systematic Sefer that we have, called Kufas HaRishonim, but the Rambam never shared with us how he arranges his halachas. And in Minchas Rosh on Shabbos, I wrote that the Rambam writes Hilchas Shabbos and Malachas Shabbos lo lefi ha'hagedorah, ela lefi ha'metzias. After all, Hilchas Ribbis is bein malva veloiva ve'ein biltam. There is no other type of Ribbis. Ribbis min ha'Torah is bein malva veloiva, and therefore, af al pi shebamahus advorim, in the essence, Hilchas Ribbis might be Yisrael v'heter, but the Rambam preferred to write Hilchas Ribbis and Hilchas Malva V'loiva because it's bein Malva V'loiva ve'ein biltoi. There is no other Ribbis. And because the Ribbis is not Nugeya only by Halavoah, that's why the Rambam decided to write Hilchas Ribbis and Malva V'loiva. Comes the Tur, and the Tur says, essentially it's about Issa V'heta. That's where it really belongs. Why don't I follow in the Rambam's footsteps and write it in Choshe Mishpot, in Hilchas Alvoah? Because anyway, we discussed one halacha of Ribbis, so let's write Hilchas Ribbis where they really belong. And that is Yoredeya and not Choshe Mishpot. Tamsis Advorim. Ein lilmoid shum dover, not from the fact that the Rambam writes it in Mishpotim, and not from the fact that the Torah writes it in Yoredeya. Generally speaking, my Talmidim know, I am very cautious in building Migdolim Aporchim Ba'aver al Digduke Leshoines. In my Svarim, in my Shiurim, any Chiddush that I am a Chadish, I base usually either on a Locha Psuka or on Shakla V'Tarya, Shalamakshin V'Tartzen. We need to be very careful with Digduke Leshoines. And there's a story I told many times, just to be madgish, how careful one needs to be medigduka l'shoines. 40 years ago, or maybe some more, I was standing in the room of my great Rebbe, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, and at the time, he was before open heart surgery. He had angina pectoris. And they didn't have much medicines then. And the rule was, when you have that pain in your chest, you need to take sugar. And Yom Kippur was approaching. And the Rebbe was dealing with a shaila, if he has te'ukat lev, don't know how it's called in English, chest pain, and he needs to take sugar, and it's going to be Yom Kippur, what should he do? Irev boi dover maris shaloi kederach achila. But the Shagas Arya maintains by Yom Kippur there's an issa d'oraisa for the shaloi kederach achila, because by Yom Kippur state kol nefesh ha-shaloi se'una. And the Gemara Daf Chofei in Masechet Psochim says, there's an issa shelo kederach achila. Maybe it's better to put the sugar in a capsule. And that would be similar to korchoi besiv. Psochim kuf tezvov state, korchoi besiv, there is no, you can't be yoytze matzah. And I was a younger man standing in the room, and a Choshev Rosh Yeshiva was there. And he said it's better to take a capsule than passel the sugar with a dover mar, because by the sug of korcha besiv b'achiles matzah lo yotzedech avosoy, the Ran says it's shelo kederech achila. Rashbam on the place, on the spot says korcha besiv is not achila, kezore kevin lachemas, and that's even less than shelo kederech achila. And I said, if the Rosh Yeshiva is right, yesh biyodi lechadish dvorim shelo yishomes en oizen miyolam a gewaldige psak. Yom Kippur, Meshesh Osamalo, you can eat whatever you want. And it's mutter lechatchila. Because in Shabbos Daf Yud Beis, the Gemara says, when should a person eat Pas Shachris? Machal Ludim, Machal Genuva, Machal Talmidei Chachomim, Mekan ve'elach, kezoyre kevin lachemas. And if zoyre kevin lachemas is even less than shelo kederech achila, gewaldige chiddush. Nobody ever said that. Not even Moshe Rabbeinu. Nobody ever said that. I'm just making a point. Sometimes you have a loshen and you're convinced it's a gewaldige diuk. You need to have a lot of bekiyas and a gefil. What's a diuk? So what I argue? Yes, the Rambam writes Ribbis and Mishpotim, Malva V'loiva. The Torah writes it in Yoredeya. Ein lochiach lo lekan v'lo lekan. Rambam doesn't prove it's a issa shebamomin. Because maybe the Rambam writes it in Hilchas Alvoah, Malva V'loiva, because that's where it is. It's a din in Alvoah at the end of the day. Why does the Torah write it in Yoredeya? L'cha'oira, it says a v'heter. But then why is there an apology? Hoyel v'osel yodon. I say, but the apology needs to make sense. Doesn't make sense because you wrote one din in Ribbis when you saw a goy, you're going to take all the dinim of Ribbis where they don't belong and write them in your Deya. It actually belongs in your Deya. And the apology is, why don't I follow in the footsteps of the Rambam? Because that's the first makar. If it would be an Isser and Gezel, how is the Torah matir Isser Ribbis? Migoy. Gezel akim also. Well, even if it is similar to Gezel, it isn't the Gezel at the end of the day. It isn't Loy Sigzel. Loy Sigzel is V'yigzel Esachanis. Medate inosam, and that's a Gemara B'Mesiyan of Samchalef. Lomali dekos v'rachmona, Gezel, Einoa, Ribbis, he gives Medate. So even if it is an Isser of Momenis, this is illegitimate money, after all, it's not Gezel, it's not Gezel Mamish. But the Tur in Kufnun Tes writes, why is it Mutal Kachas Ribbis Megoi? Because the Isser Ribbis is about V'chayechichu Imach. And that's why it doesn't apply to a Goy. And that's a Chiddush. From V'chayechichu Imach we learn as Ribbis Tzitzi Yoytze B'Dayonim. But the Gemara doesn't say that is the reasoning of Isser Ribbis in the first place. Of the ganze Isser is Mishum V'chayechichu Imach. Kachos of a Tur. Why is it Mutal Kachas Ribbis Megoi? Because Ribbis is all about V'chayechichu Imach. So that proves it's not Isser Shabbat It's Isser V'heter. V'chayechichu Imach, and that is why there is no Isser Megoi. Once again, it is more of a diak l'shayni. Ve'efshar shapshat betur, b'Ribbis state v'chayechichu imach, bo lelamed, not only that there's no Isser, no chiyuv to give back Ribbis to a goy, but there is no b'chlal Isser Ribbis b'goy. If it would be Choshe Mishpat, similar to Gezel, how could there be Isser on the Aloiva? Is the Nigzal Oiva Be'Isser if somebody steals from him? Or a Nignav? Or the person that was cheated in Dina and Noah? If it's a Isser Shebamomen, how could there be Isser on the Loiva? And the Loiva and the Malva are Oiva the same lav. So how could it be two-sided if it's not Isser V'heter? If it's Isser V'heter, there could be Isser on the Malva and the Loiva. The Iker Isser is on the Malva. The Loiva is at Tosefes, Kosev Ramban and Parshas Mishpotim. And the Ramban B'Perusha HaTorah deals exactly with this question. Why would there be an Isser on the Loiva? And the fact that the Ramban is troubled by this question proves that it's similar to Gezel. It's an Isser Shebamomoin. And the Ramban writes, Meroiv regilus hachet k'dei laharchek Isser Ribbis, the Torah placed the Isser on the Loiva as well. So I need to be Magdem Esa Ma'uchar and explain. Kosav Arashbo, Chuvas HaMichosas LaRamban. And these Chuvas will be forever called Chuvas HaMichosas, because we make them there was some doubt. Whose Chuvas are these, the Ramban or the Rashbo? Today we know beyond any doubt it's Chuvas HaRashbo, but that's the name of these Chuvas. Chuvas HaMichosas LaRamban, Chuvas HaRashbo, Reish Chov Gimel. The Rashba explains that Ribbis is be'etzem schirus, no different than any other schirus. So how many dinim of schirus do we have in Choshe Mishpat? Schirus karka, schirus metaltalin, schirus behema, schirus poyalim. And they're all the same. When you want to use something that doesn't belong to you, you pay for it. You rent a car, you rent a house, Schiras poyalim. You're taking advantage of the work, of the toil of other people, you should pay for it. It is unreasonable that you take benefit of anything that belongs to another person without paying for it. So why would Ribbis be any different? And that is why in the big world, nobody thinks there's anything wrong with Ribbis. It goes without saying. You can't use my house without paying for it. You're not entitled to use my car without paying for it. Why should you use my money without paying for it? If it's not Isser V'heter, if it's not Gzeis HaKosef, then what would be the Avla in Ribbis? I'll explain to you very clearly. And as an Av based in for almost 30 years. I see this all the time. If you can't afford an expensive car, you won't rent an expensive car. You won't rent a Ferrari or a Porsche, or in Etzisur we have a type of car, I don't know whether you have it in England, it's called Subaru Avreichim. That's a very special car, Subaru Avreichim. As you open the door, even if you're a blind person, you're aware that you're going into that car. You don't need to see it to be aware. You have to clean off the seat for 10 minutes before you sit down, and that is Subaru Avreichim. If you can't afford an expensive car, you're going to rent a Subaru Avreichim. If you can't afford an expensive house, you're going to rent a little flat. But if you're pressed for money, you're going to promise any price that is demanded to get that money. Yardu Torah l'sof dati shalodom. And the Torah also recognizes the koyach of greed. And whenever there's a person that will be willing to pay, there will be others that will be more than willing to take. And that is why people are destroyed by Ribbis. Doesn't happen by schiras batim, doesn't happen by schiras poyalim. If you can't renovate your house and take the best kablan, you're going to settle for second best. But if you need money and you're strapped for cash, you're going to pay any price. Even though you know I'll never be able to repay this loan with the interest. And when somebody is willing to pay, there will always be those that will be happy to strangle him and take away his money. And that is why the Torah asad Ribbis, even though essentially, it's schiras, like any other schiras. That's why the loiv is also over. Because the Torah wants to be maflik be'isa Ribbis and make sure that this is something that nobody will do. The ikka is on the malva. The kachas v'rashoyim b'bo metziyad afayin. Moa shel yisoy memutal al voisam beribes. Mutter shoy, moa shoy. Wie?
This has a state in Nashville.
No. No. The Rashba doesn't deal with Bechlal why did the Torah say Ribbis. All I quoted from the Rashba is that Ribbis is schiras. If not the Torah said this, there would be no other. No, nothing wrong with Ribbis. A Choshev Talmud Chochem 100 years ago wrote in his cipher that maybe the world has changed and today we should be matir Ribbis because today it is considered legitimate. And that's a terrible toss. It's a terrible toss. I mean, changing norms can't be matter and issa diurais. I don't want to mention his name because he was a Choshev Talmud Chochem. But sometimes even Choshev Talmid Chachomim make big mistakes. What I did quote is the Ramban. The reason the Torah asked for the loive is merov regilo sachet, and I think pshat in the Ramban is as I explain. So in Bo Metziyat Afayim Amud Aleph, the Gemara says, Moshe Yisrael Memutal al Voisam Beribis, and Toises and all the Rishonim ask, what about the loive? So the Malv is a Yosaim. Chazal were mata Moshe Yisrael Memutal al Voisam Beribis. What about the loive? The loive is not a Yosim. What heter does he have to pay Ribbis? Because what is showing him? There's only an Issa on the loive if there's an Issa on the Malva. If there's no Issa on the Malva, no Issa on the loive. This proves that the loive is a tuffle. The loive is secondary. And therefore, this doesn't prove it's Yoredeya. It's Choshe Mishpot. It's Dumya de Gezel. But the reason the Torah asked it for the loive as well, Lahachik is Sa'odem and Aveira. Because it is so easy and so expected that people will be nichshal in Isser Ribbis. Number 4, and that is one of the most important sources, and that's the first sugya in Eizeh Neshech, Daf Samech Aleph. The Gemara asks, Lamali da Asr Torah, Gezel and Oav Ribbis. Doesn't this prove that Gezel and Oav Ribbis have something in common? B'yesoid Sheldova is the Zel Bezach. It says, Momen Shalachayrim, Momen She'einoi Shaloi. However, the Gemara explains, we cannot learn one from the other. Gezel Bal Karchoi. Ainoah Medatei. But Ainoah is not forced to give, but he's cheated. He's not aware that he's giving more than he needs to give. He's overpaying. Mashenken Ribbis is Legamre Medatei. And therefore, we can't learn from one from another. So the Maksha definitely understood that Ribbis is Choshe Mishpot. It's an Issa Shabbat, but maybe the Tartzim, that's exactly what he explains. Ribbis is different. A gewaltige Chiddush in Tosas Arosh. Tosas Arosh says that even the Maksha was aware that Ribbis has nothing to do with Gezel and Ainua. And Ribbis agav orchei nokat. That's the Tosas Arosh. And he says, the real question was only, what is the difference between Gezel and Ainua? But if the Gemara already asked, Gezel Ainua, he threw in Ribbis as well, even though there was no Havim in it, that Ribbis is the same as Gezel Ainua. That is something only a Rishon could say. If a Nachman would write that, we would smile. Zominayin Lacha. But that's what the Tosas Arosh says on the spot in Bov Metzia Daf Samach Aleph. And I'm like, Ribbis. I wrote a few Rosh L'Shitosai, but we don't have time to get into that. Tosas Daf Ayin Omid Beis, and on my list this is number 5. Tosas is Mesupik, what the Goyim have in Issa Ribbis. Not Ben Goyli Yisrael. Goyim Ben Zelezeh. Suffolk and Tosas, state to roots in Betosis, Ayin Omid Beis, Ayin Aleph Omid Aleph. Our Goyim, do they have a Issa of Ribbis? And the Tzdodim are the Muda Gezel. One of the Sheva Mitzvahs Ben Enoyach is Gezel. So I think the Suffolk and Tosas is clearly, how do we define Ribbis? Is it Dumi the Gezel or not? And one of the Sheva Mitzvah Neich is Gezel. And even the Tzad and Tosas that says Goyim do not have an Issa Ribbis doesn't prove it's Issa Vehet. As I said at the beginning of the Shiur, it could be a Issa Shebemomin, but it's not Gezel. However, the Mitzvah Shebenei Noyach, Gezel includes more than Yisrael. And that is a Klal Godel. The Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach are Sheva Shroshim, and they include what in Torah's Moshe, Lahavdil, could be many different mitzvahs. So L'cha'ora, the Suffolk and Tosas is, how do we define Issa Ribbis? And now, Rambam Ramban, L'shitosam, L'cha'ora, Begimel Mekoymes. The Rambam does not include in Sefer HaMitzvahs, B'minyan Mitzvahs Aseh V'chai Chicho Imach, that we need to repay, give back Ribbis that we have taken. And the Gemara says, Ribbis Tusi Yoitze B'diyonim, and we learn it from V'chai Chichu Imach. And the Ramban, Shechach Hasarav, in the list of mitzvahs that the Ramban argues, the Rambam omitted, Shochach, and we assume Loi Shochach. Don't call it Shechach Hasarav. The Rambam didn't write it, he had a reason not to write it, as all the other Achronim are Miyashiv Shittas Rambam. But the Ramban writes, Mrs. Sheshochach Harav, Mrs. Yud Zayin, why didn't the Rambam count? L'chai uchichu imach. Megillah Esther, one of the Choshavs, the Noise Kelim of the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, Kosa Megillah Esther, the Rambam holds that it's Veishav Segzela. L'chai uchichu imach is just a Gilu Milsa. But then it falls back to the Mrs. Aseh, Veishav Segzela. So the Rambam holds v'heishev v'segzela. The Ramban holds no. We would never know the din of Asoros Ribbis has nothing to do with Gzela. No semedate. So the Rambam holds it's Choshe Mishpot, and maybe the Ramban holds it's Issa Veheter. Rambam Perek Daled Alochi Yud Gimel as a machlokes with the Gaonim. Mechila. Does Mechila help? Is Mechila valid by Ribbis? The question is not whether Mechila permits taking Ribbis. Vaday Shaloi. Every time a person pays Ribbis, he pays Medatoi. The Machlokes Rambam in the Gaonim is Mechila in Achzoros Ribbis. Ribbis is Yoitze B'diyonim. The Gaonim say no. And the Rambam says Mechila is valid. Does that prove it's mominous? Maybe even if it's Issa Veheta, Mechila will help. But the Rambam writes, Beferish kamo b'gezela. And if the Rambam writes, Mechila is valid by Ribbis kamo b'gezela, that seems clearly to indicate that according to the Rambam, it's Dumi the Gzela. And the Rambam L'shitosoi from V'heishav is Gzela. And that's why the Rambam doesn't count V'chai Chichu Imach as a mitzvah b'fnei atzmo. Rambam Perek Daled Alochavuv. And the Chinuch makes a machlokes between Rambam and Ramban. Haim yordim lenachosov. to give back Ribbis. The Rambam holds Yod and Achosov, and the Ramban says no, it's just a mitzvah say. Like other mitzvahs say, Ein Yod and Achosov. So the Rambam Lishitosoi, Yod and Achosov, because it's like any other chiyuv momoin based in Yod and Achosov. So once again, maybe Yod and Achosov, even though it's not Dumya de Gezel, but Chinuch quotes the Rambam, Kamo b'gzelis v'chabolois. So Lashonis do matter. I said at the beginning of the Shiur always. But if the Rambam writes Kamo b'gezel, that's Kamo b'gezel. And if Sefer Chinuch Shimem Gimel quotes the Rambam Kamo b'gzelis v'chavolos, it's like zelis v'chavolos. So we have three Rambams l'shitosoi that l'chayra Ribbis is Choshe Mishpat. And this brings us all the way back. So maybe that is why the Rambam writes Ribbis in Sefer Mishpatim and not in Sefer Kedusha with other halachas of Issa v'Heta. Shelo ke minag hatur. Kosav Taz, and the Taz writes it twice. Hilchas Ribbis Kuf Samach Aleph Yoredeya, Simetes Choshe Mishpat. What's Simetes Choshe Mishpat? The Issa of Shoichad. And the Taz maintains, by Shoichad and by Ribbis, there is no chiyuv to give back Ribbis unless the loiva that paid the Ribbis demands his money back. As long as there is no tviyah, there is no chiyuv to give back Ribbis. And l'choreh, that's Rashi. Ribbis tzitz yoytzer dayonim. Rashi writes one word, kishetavoi. L'choreh, Rashi proves the Taz. And that is Shelo Kedivrei Asma. We have no Sma on Hilchas Ribbis. We have a big kuntres on Hilchas Ribbis from the Sma, but not on the Shulchan Aruch. But the Sma Choshe Mishpat Simetes writes, Ribbis is just like any other gezel, ve'ishav s'gzeile, afal pi shelo tovoi. Once again, efshar shebekach nechlaku. And now we go all the way back to Sugyas HaGemara. Twice in Shas, Bovakama Kuf Yud Beis, But Messiah Samach Beis Amud Aleph. Heniach lem aviem Ribbis. The Yisraelim do not need to give back the Ribbis that their father accumulated. And it's a Machlokes Ameroim, Reb Chia bar Choma and Rava. Why don't the Yisraelim need to pay back the Ribbis that their father collected? Is it because Rishus Yorish ki Rishus Lekeach and the Yorsham are kind of Yesh V'Shin Rishis? Rava says no. L'didei Azerachmona, Lebrei Lo Azerachmona. So the Machlokes Rambam and Ramban is a Machlokes Ameroim. The first opinion is Yesh V'Shin Rishis. Yesh V'Shin Rishis is a din in Gnei V'Gzeila. No, nowhere else is there a concept of Yesh V'Shin Rishis. By Shuvas Aveda there is no Yesh V'Shin Rishis. It's a din in Gnei V'Gzeila. So he maintains it's Choshe Mishpat. Rava says v'chaychu rimach l'didei azarachmona lebrei lo yazarachmona halacha karova. So would the halacha be that it's yoredei yisaveta l'didei azarachmona lebrei lo azarachmona? Machlokes achronim. How do we understand Rava halacha kemoisei? Machna Ephraim in Hilchos Ribbis says gezeres akosuf. It doesn't prove that it's not the gezel. Gezeres akosuf. And the gezeres akosuf is l'didei azarachmona lebrei lo yazarachmona, and that is Simon Beis Machna Ephraim in Hilchos Halva v'Ribbis. Mishnah Melech Perik Ches Halacha Aleph in Hilchos Malva v'Loi v'Rambam. Shara Melech. Mishnah Melech is in Perik Dalet, not in Perik Ches. Shara Melech is in Hilchos Ishus, not in Hilchos Malva v'Loi. And they are mefarish the Gemara kipshutoi. According to Rav, it's a mitzvah sasei, like any other mitzvah sasei. Has nothing to do with gzeila. L'didei azarachmona imach v'chaychichu imach lebrei lo azarachmona. And that is actually a machlokes in the Rishonim. The Ritva clearly is mefarish shitas Rav shaloche kemoisoi v'chaychichu imach. It's a mitzvah sasei bi'alma. And there is a few ritvas, not one but three ritvas in Perikei Zeneshach and in Kiddushin Davav, The Ritva maintains it is Issa v'Heter. And this is Pshat Nerova, L'didei Azachmon L'brei Lo Yarachmon. Shita Makabetzes brings B'Shem Arash Mishans, like the Machna Ephraim. It's Exersakos. So even this Gemara, Rava, that seems clearly to say that it's not Gezel, and therefore it's not like Moaz Gozel that the Yoshim need to give back. L'didei Azachmon L'brei Lo Yarachmon. But Messiah Samachei, we learn a Gavaldige Chiddush. Person collected a beged as a Ribbis. He was given a garment, a beged, glimo. Ribbis Tzitzi Yotzim V'Dionim, but he could give money. He doesn't need to give that glima back. V'heishav is a gzela. If the gzela is be'en, the Gazlan can't give money. You're out of your mind. This is mine. Chaim Shnaim Yishalim. It is only if the Geneva is nevad or is koyde b'shinui, then he pays money. But a Gazan is not entitled to say, I stole your beketche, how much did it cost? I'm giving you money. But Ribbis, yes. The Machna Ephraim, and it's a gewaldige Chiddush. The Machna Ephraim wants to learn from this halacha, the din of glima in Ribbis Simon Beis, that if a person bought a chayfetz and it's a mekach tos, he doesn't need to give the chayfetz back, he could pay money. And he compares that to Ribbis. But it's a gewaldige chiddush. If it's mekach tos, mekach bottle, miltze the pshita, that you need to give back whatever you achieved, whatever it is b'rishtuscho. And the Mishnah Melech, clearly in Perek Ches, the Mishnah Melech explains this Gemara, because by Ribbis, he's koina. It's just exerts a kosev, and if it's about that is the same pasuk from which we learn Mrs. Tzedakah. So you could pay money. If it's all about not destroying his livelihood, you don't need to give the beggar back. So according to understanding of Mishnah Melech, and lecha'oira kach mashma pashtus asugya, that the person that collected Ribbis has a kinyan gomer in that Ribbis. It's not gezel b'yodoy, shasa mitzvah v'chaychich u'imoch. And therefore, he could pay money, and he doesn't need to give that back. Dogal mervavo. Simen Kuf, Samach Aleph. The Gemara deals with the question, Heniach lehem aviem Ribbis. The malva that collected Ribbis. And the malva died. Do the Yoshim need to pay that back? What is the din? Emeis haloiva. Emeis haloiva. If the loiva died, and the malva collected Ribbis, does it need to give it back, the Ribbis, to the Yorshe haloiva? Not the Yorshe malva, they need to give back. The malva is alive. The loiva died. And the Dogal Mavova argues, Potor, V'chai ochicho imoch, he, not his children. After Pisharibis Tzitziyoytz B'dayonim, that is only to the loiva, but not to the loiva's children. And the Dogal Mavova clearly says it's a mitzvah. V'chai ochicho imoch. And now we come back to the fundamental question, because all the sources we dealt with, and according to my list, I didn't really count, but now we're up to number 13. So all the sources we dealt with is about the Ribbis that was collected, and we're dealing with the question of giving back. Ribbis Tzitziyoytz B'dayonim. Aber wisst der Ritvom in Kedushin Vova mit Beis, in the Suga of Makadosh B'Melava. What are we talking about? Mechilas Melva, Mikudeshes. And the Gemara says, Ida Arvach Lo Zimna, Ribbis Ma'al Yesehi. And all the Rishonim say, Ribbis Ma'al Yeseh, it's Ribbis Goma, you can't pay Ribbis. So the Kedushin isn't Chal. The Ritva says, no, the Kedushin is Chal. And the Kash of the Gemara is, why do you call it Haromis Ribbis if it's Ribbis Gemura? And the Ritva says, when people have an agreement and you borrowed money beribis, there is a shibid nachosim. Choshe Mishpot dictates you need to pay that ribis. Then Yoredeya intervenes and Yoredeya says, no, don't listen to Choshe Mishpot. You can't pay that ribis. That is what the Ritva says. So the Ritva doesn't use the Lashonis Choshe Mishpat in Yeredeya because in the days of the Ritva there was no Choshe Mishpat in Yeredeya. But what the Ritva clearly says is there is a Shiabud. There is a Shibed HaNechsa Aloiva, Shibed HaGuf, and Shibed Nechosim. But he's not allowed to pay, and the Malva is not allowed to collect. And that is Isur. But therefore, if he was Mekadesh Mitribis, Over Be'isur, Aval Arei Mekudeshes, because she's kind of that money. Because it's not Gezel. And that is what everybody understood. The Avnei Miluim, the Avnei Nezer, the Shemesh Kopin Shari Yoshe Shar Hei, the Ritva. That is what everybody understood in Ritva besides the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish twice in his Svorim. Yoredeya Sebenayin, Even Eza Membeis. It's the same shtickle. And anybody familiar with the Chazon Ish knows that's very common in Chazon Ish. Same piece is in more than one place. And this is so typical of the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish is convinced about something nobody could get him off. And I quote this Chazon Ish a lot of times, bitzarli, when I'm in a difficult place. I quote the Chazon Ish, mutav lanu litchoik beroshen harashonim kedei lahamed es advorim al buriyam. And the Chazon Ish writes, there could be no such a thing that Choshe Mishpat says yes and Yeredeya says no. It's impossible. Ein davar kase. It's impossible that in Mumanis is a shibid and in Isav Heter is a prohibition. Chazon Ish doesn't like the idea. But it's in the Ritva. Chazon Ish says it can't be in the Ritva. If it can't be, it can't be. And he says a perish dochok in Ritva. And therefore I say, the Chazon Ish has one opinion. The Avnei Miluim, the Shemesh Kopin, the Avnei Nezer, and the Ritva have a different opinion. Because the way the Chazon Ish understands the Ritva is not the Ritva. Godel Merabin Shemoy. My Talmidim know. To me the Chazon Ish is a Rishon. To me the Chazon Ish is a Rishon. He was flung 500 years out of his natural environment. Our generation should see how a Rishon learned. So, all the Achronim, including the Ritva, they understood the Ritva, that there's a Shibud, but it's an Isser. Chazon Ish says, how could this be? The Torah is Mikshachas. Can it be something that you can't pay and you can't collect, and there still is a Shibud? It's a Tarta de Sasa. It's a Dova Vehipuchoy. So the Chazon Ish has a different pshat in the Ritva. But to Emes Yoredarkoi, it's a Chiddush, and the Ritva is a Das Yochid maybe, aber das ist was steht in der Ritva. And the Ritva says, in Mumanis, there is a Shibud. In Isav Heter, it's an Isser. So we saw many sources, Lekan u'Lechan. What's the mahus of Isser Ribbis? One of the most important Svorim on Ribbis is the Shar Deya. And the Shar Deya is the Shar Mishpat and Choshe Mishpat. He had a Mazel Bish that he was 50 years younger than the Ktsois HaChoshen. And I say, if not for the Ktsois HaChoshen, the Shar Mishpat would have been the Ktsois HaChoshen. But the Ktsois HaChoshen came before him, and therefore he was born under the huge tzel and the umbrella of the Ktsois HaChoshen. So one of the Choshev Svarim in Hilchos Ribbis is Shar Deya. And Shar Deya has an interesting discussion twice. Kuf Nun Tes, relatively the beginning of Hilchos Ribbis, and Kuf Ayin Zayin, the very end of Hilchos Ribbis. Kuf Nun Tes, he has a suffix. Person took alvor b'Ribbis, and before payday came, hey merdosa, he became a mumar, v'muta lakachas Ribbis memumar. Is the malva entitled to collect that Ribbis or not? B'shas dalvo, he was a tzaddik. Lo aleinu, v'lo aleichem. Before the time came to pay, hey merdosa. So, if in Ribbis there is a shibid mamoini, like the Ritva says, there is a shibid. The Isser is to collect. When time comes to collect, he's a mumar. and I'm entitled to take Ribbis from him. But if Ribbis isn't chal mi'ikora, then there never was a chayiv. If there wasn't a chayiv, the chayiv isn't born when he becomes a mumar. In B'shas Alvoa, there was no chayiv of Ribbis, then you're not entitled to collect that Ribbis. So the suffix of the Shah Mishpah depends on the two drochim that we're talking about. And it's a Mekufay Zayin. The Shah Mishpah deals with the question when there's a suffix in Isser Ribbis, is it Sveik in Surah L'chumra, or suffix Momen L'kula? And according to these two Sveikis in Shah Mishpah, Ha Baha Talya. So just one last comment. So we had 15 Mekoiris dealing with the question, how do we define Ribbis? And I think definitely all the sources in Gemara and Rishonim, Yesh Todim Lakan Ulachan. Medivre Achroinim, we brought Kama V'Kama Mekoiris that are borrowed to Shemesh. I am more noiter because of the Rishonis of the Rambam, Mechile Kamoy Gezel, Shibin Nechosem Kamog Zeles B'Chabolois, that Ribbis is Mi'isure HaMomoin. Mi'isure HaMomoin, B'Yesoide Shel Dovar. The big problem is Rava. The Didei Azarachmona, the Brei Lo Azarachmona. So, unlike many other sigis, I don't have a clear maskona. But sometimes just it's Dodim, it's Dodim, and Dakos Sheben Yonim, that is the Ta'eres of Limud. So I'm sure that this Choshev Koilel, or maybe there's more than one Koilel here, I don't know, but the Choshev Rechem learning Hilchas Ribbis, and this is a question that will come up again and again, Metchilas Hilchas Ribbis at Soifoi, and I have a bekosha to you. If you have any ha'oris on what I said, or ha'isofis, write to me. Please let me know. Minoi u'minaichi t'shtayim shmaitzet. What would be the din of Ribbis? Lulei she'asro to'ere hilchas Ribbis. So I quoted the Tshuvas Rashba. The Rashba says Ribbis essentially is schirus. If not the Torah asad Ribbis, Ribbis would be taken for granted, just like in the entire world. In the modern world, nobody thinks there's anything wrong with Ribbis. Why should you think people are going to give you money without paying for it? Bains, Gemilis Chosodim. And halvo is a Mrs. Asek, Im Kesef Tal Vesami. So it is a covered for the film community that billions of dollars are in Gemachim. Billions of dollars. And a Yid that needs cash many times will find the money without paying Ribbis. So according to the Rashba, Milsa de Pshita, if the Torah wouldn't ask a Ribbis, of course you would need to pay. V'kach kosav v'chavzadas. Semakuf ayin, sif koten hey. Kach kosav v'chazarish. In both sources that I quoted, Even Ezer Membeis and Yoredei Semenayin. A gewaltige Chiddush in Chasam Sofer. Chasam Sofer says, Gam lulei she'osra Torah Ribbis, there will be no chiyuv to pay Ribbis. And why not? Because of Chasam Sofer, it's not like Schiris, because there is no pras. You rent a car, there is wear and tear, depreciation. You rent a house, but not always do you give it back exactly in the state that it was when you rented it. V'kach b'kol dover, v'kach b'metaltalin. But by Mois, money is money. You're giving back exactly what you received. There is no pras, and therefore there's no justification to pay. And that's a gewaldige chiddush, because the havana pshuta of schiris, you're not paying for damages. You're paying for the benefit of using and enjoying and something that doesn't belong to you. That is the reason you pay. That's what schiris is. That is rentals. What?
It's not
Yes, yeah. So your question is, why didn't I include this insight from the sources that I mentioned before? It would be number 16. Yeah, but the Chasam Sofer is a gewaldige chiddush. Even though l'choira is a raya from Rav Chome's Havamina and the Gemara's Maskona. The Gemara Samech Tesam at Weiss. Rav Chome rented out money, and he said, "I'm renting, I'm not, it's not a halva, it's Chiris. And that's a Gavaldige Suga. I don't know whether you learned the Chama yet, but that's a Suga b'fnei Asmei, Samech Tesam and Beis. The Gemara says no. You can't rent out money. So that Gemara might be a raya that the essence of Schirus is Pras, and not only Pras, but also Pras. So today we discussed the fundamental sugi in Hilchos Ribbis. Is a Ribbis Mahi? And that is the most yesodistic question when we learn Hilchos Ribbis. What is Ribbis all about? Is it Choshe Mishpot, like the Rambam writes it in Sefer Mishpotim? Is it Issa Veheta? Does it belong in Yoredeya? And we dealt with, I thought 15 sources. The Rosh Koilo corrected me, 16 sources. And the question, what is Ribbis all about? According to the Chassam Sofer, it definitely would be L'cha'oire Choshe Mishpot, because you have no entitlement to take this Ribbis, fill it all b'dina momenis. It's not a rental. Hafoichba v'afoichbo de kilaba. Yerotzim, we should always be zoicha l'agel Torah l'dira. I'm on my way to the airport.